So the question is, what's the best way to get your mix nice and loud without it sounding squashed or distorted? And also, what's the best way to achieve a nice, wide, heavy guitar mix? Welcome to Viewer Questions Answered, episode 26. So without any further ado, let's jump into this excellent group of questions submitted by my loyal email subscribers. And our first question here comes from Efluvia. Efluvia, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Quick question. Situation: I record a live kit except MIDI kicks and sometimes toms and blend them into the drum bus with only an SSL compressor for glue and maybe a slight EQ. I still find it's still a little artificial glue-wise. Should I not include the MIDI drums into the drum bus, have its own bus, or create some sort of faux room to gel the MIDI and live kit together? Thanks, Bobby. Love your YouTube channel, by the way. Okay, well, Fluvia, this is a great question. And honestly, the sound of a kit being glued together is an issue even if you're using programmed drums, all live drums with no samples, or if you're in a situation kind of like yourself where you're using drum samples with live drums. Glue can be challenging. And I found that it really comes down to a combination of techniques in order to achieve that nice gelled, glued together drum sound that sounds like it's one unified instrument and not a bunch of separate elements, and also without it sounding overly squashed, because that's also sort of a challenge. Now, the way I like to achieve a glued together drum sound, whether it's all live drums, MIDI drums, or a combination of the two, like you're mentioning, is I like to use some subtle bus compression. Also, I might use some parallel compression if I want a more extreme version of compression without the drum sounding squashed, and also a simple clipper or tape saturator on my drum bus I find really helps glue the sound of my kit together. The trick here is to do little bits of processing along the way. So you can't just magically glue the sound of your kit together, at least in my opinion, with a single compressor or a single tape saturator. It's a few different processes that build up throughout the duration of your mix. This is why back in the day when people would mix on analog, it was sometimes a little easier because the tape machine would add a sonic character to the tracks. And then the board would add some nice subtle saturation and extra glue. And then all of the outboard gear and everything else kind of parked all of the instruments within their own world, including drums. And we're kind of missing that in DAWs. Things are often too clean and too separate sounding. And this is why, again, little processes like what I just mentioned will really help glue the sound of your kit together. And also, a classic trick is to just use the same reverb on all of your individual drum tracks, snare, toms, maybe your kick if it's slower music, but just using one unified reverb send will help glue the sound of your kit together. Great question. I'll definitely be covering this topic more in future videos. Okay, our next question here comes from Joseph. Hey Bobby, great video. Any chance you can cover the topic of getting loud mixes in terms of mastering? It's giving me headaches. Okay, well Joseph, much like with the issue of gluing your drums together, I found that the trick to a nice loud master that's professional, but not overly clipped or distorted or crappy sounding, is applying little bits of processing throughout your mix and then eventually on your mix bus and then eventually within mastering itself. I've covered this in previous videos. I'll leave a link below down to one of them in this video's description. But the long and short of it, again, is to do a little bit of compressing on your mix bus, then a little bit of tape saturation to take off some transient. And I even go as far as then using a little bit of multi-band compression and then finally limiting on my master fader and eventually in the mastering process. But here's the trick. All of these processes are doing very, very little work individually, and the net effect is a loud master that's very natural sounding. And a pro tip for you is to make sure that your drum bus is in control, because an overly spiky, untreated drum bus will make mastering very difficult because you'll have extreme snare transients poking through your mix, and that alone will make it hard to achieve a loud master. So Joseph, thanks again for your question. It's a good one, and I'll definitely be covering this more in the near future in some new tutorials. Okay, and our next question here comes from Rory. Learned a ton from your channel and I have a fat tone dialed into my virtual system. A guitar into a Scarlett 2i2 and then into a THU. What I really want to know is I want to get that wide, rich metal wah sound that usually comes from putting the pedal after the distortion. How would you do that with your setup? Thanks in advance. Okay, well Rory, when it comes to a wider guitar sound, in my experience, the effect being pre or post distortion. The only effect that's really going to affect the width would be a stereo delay. The trick to a wide guitar sound is to use a similar tone on both sides, but to change up one variable. For example, maybe you're using the exact same amp on both sides, but you're using a different guitar on one of the two sides. So the guitar will have slightly different intonation on both sides, and this will give you a naturally wider sound at the source. A more effective way even would be to change the cab on one side, or maybe change the microphone placement on one side, or the IR on one side. Now, on the topic of IRs, if you're looking to achieve a nice wide heavy guitar tone that sounds great at the source and you're using amp sims, you can download my impulse response octapack. You get 8 impulse responses, 4 microphones, 2 mic placements per microphone. You get 2 SM57s, 2 SM81s, 2 Sennheiser E609s, as well as 2 Electro Voice RE16s. The Octapack is absolutely free, and there's a link below in this video's description where you could download it and use it right away. So for example, if you download the Octapack and you have your favorite amp sim plugin, you don't even need to use multiple amp sims. You could use the same plugin, and on your left guitar, you could use SM57 number 1, and then on your right guitar, you could use SM57 number 2. The tones are similar, obviously, because it's the same cab with the same microphone, but the placement is slightly different, and you'll end up with a nice wide guitar sound without having to rely on stereo wideners or any other gimmicky mix trick like that. You're nailing it right at the source. And again, if you're using live amps, you can do the same thing simply by changing the microphone placement on either side, using a different cab, using a different guitar, maybe even using a different head. The idea is simple. It's to change something on the left and right sides, and you naturally will achieve a nice wide tone. Hope that helps. Excellent question. All right, our final question here comes from Ruby. Hey Bobby, first of all, thanks for sharing all these great tutorials. I'm watching almost every video you release, and your IRs are fantastic. During watching your last video, a question came to mind. When mixing a complete album of a band, do you mix all songs in one Pro Tools project, or do you create a dedicated project for every individual song? Best regards and greetings from Germany. All right, man, well, this is an excellent question. And honestly, there is no right or wrong way. I've seen producers do an entire album within one Pro Tools project or Logic project or Cubase project, and it makes sense. It'll save you a ton of time. If you have one drum sound throughout your entire album, it's all there in one session. You don't have to duplicate your settings over the course of 10 or 15 songs. And I used to do the same thing back in the day. The problem with me is I found that it became very clumsy and very complicated once you start implementing automation. So I eventually worked my way over to just having individual mixes for individual songs, and I'm just really, really careful with importing the same settings into each of my individual songs. And one way I make this process a little more efficient is I'll mix one song for the band and make sure that it's approved 100%, and then I'll use that song as my mix template for the rest of the songs, and then all I have to do from there is just individual specialized mix moves on a per song basis, like custom automation, maybe a slightly different EQ on certain background elements or gang vocals or leads or extra synth tracks. But the base of the mix is done in that initial song that's approved by the band. And then again, I could use that template for the rest of the album. I find it's just more efficient than having everything in one giant Pro Tools session. I used to do that, but things would get very complicated once I became a little more involved with automation. And when you have mixed notes and remembering which revision is happening in one song and so on, it just gets really complicated. So I prefer to have separate Pro Tools sessions per song throughout the course of an EP or an album. So dude, excellent question, and hopefully that points you in the right direction. I'd just like to shout out and thank everyone for submitting this excellent group of questions. And if you've submitted a question and I haven't got to it yet, just be patient. I'll definitely get to it within one of these videos in this series. If you found this video helpful, like, comment, subscribe, and share. And do not forget to click the little bell icon so you can be notified every time I upload little weekly videos on all things Metal Rock production. If you're interested in some Frightbox swag, I've got t-shirts, mugs, and a ton of other cool stuff on the way. There's a link below to the Frightbox merch store in this video's description. And again, if you're looking for impulse responses that were captured right at the source that need minimal tweaking, you can download my free Amp Sim Octapack. There's a link below in this video's description. And until next time, happy mixing.